In the dark Pacific, there's a moment every sailor learns to fear, the moment the radar call comes in, and you realize the sky is not just incoming, it's hunting you. The engines are distant at first, a low growl swallowed by wind and waves. But then the sound sharpens, and you can feel it in your ribs. Men sprint to their stations, gun mounts swing up, and someone says the one word that turns your stomach cold: kamikaze. You look up and you see one aircraft, then two, then a whole line of them dropping out of the haze, flying low and fast, not to scare you, not to damage you, but to hit you, to turn your ship into fire. And here's the nightmare. Even if your gunners are perfect, even if your tracking is flawless, your shells still have to explode at the right time. Too early, the plane flies through the burst. Too late, it's already on top of you. For years, anti-aircraft fire was a numbers game: throw enough steel into the sky and pray the timing works out. But in 1943, the United States brought something into combat that made the old rules feel obsolete overnight. A shell that didn't need you to guess. A shell that could sense when it was close. A shell that carried a tiny radio brain inside it, small enough to fit in your hand, tough enough to survive being fired from a gun, and secret enough that if the enemy captured it, the war could change in the other direction. Because once this weapon arrived, pilots stopped trusting near misses. Fleets started surviving attacks that should have broken them, and the enemy watching aircraft fall out of the sky as if the air itself too. Understand why veterans and historians still talk about this invention with a kind of quiet respect. You have to understand the problem it solved and why so many smart people once believed it couldn't be done. Before this weapon existed, anti-aircraft defense looked powerful on paper. Fast crews, sophisticated sights, careful calculations, but in the air, against a fast-moving target that could change speed and direction in seconds, power didn't automatically translate into protection. The truth was cruel. You didn't actually need to miss by much to miss entirely. A shell that bursts 50 yards behind a plane is a useless flash. A shell that bursts 50 yards in front is a wasted round. A shell that bursts at exactly the right time and place can be deadly without ever touching the aircraft. But getting that timing right under combat stress, vibration, smoke, screaming engines, evasive maneuvers was a gamble that cost lives. Early in the war, most anti-aircraft shells relied on mechanical time fuses, and those fuses had to be set before firing. That meant sailors and gunners were forced to predict the future for a few seconds at a time. How far would the shell travel? How quickly would it climb? Where would the aircraft be when the fuse finished its countdown? In a controlled test range, a skilled crew might do well. In the chaos of a real attack, predictions drifted, targets shifted, and the difference between close enough and too late was sometimes the width of a heartbeat. That is why anti-aircraft fire, for a long time, functioned like a storm rather than a scalpel. The idea was not precision but saturation. Put enough bursts in the sky and hope one of them happened to bloom near an aircraft at the right moment. In many defenses, the numbers were grim: hundreds or even thousands of rounds fired for each aircraft destroyed, depending on altitude, conditions, training, and accounting. Pilots understood the weak point, even without elite tactics. A pilot who varied altitude and approach could turn a carefully calculated time setting into a near miss that didn't matter. The guns were capable of killing, but the ammunition didn't always know when to do it. So now imagine someone walks into that reality and says something that sounds like science fiction for the early 1940s. Put a radar inside the shell. Make the shell detonate when it gets close to the target. Don't ask the gun crew to guess. Don't ask the predictor to be perfect. Give the shell the ability to decide when it's in lethal range. That idea, in one sentence, is the radio proximity fuse, also known by its wartime label. The VT fuse, variable time, a deliberately bland name used to hide what it really was. But at the time, the idea sounded almost absurd. Radar itself was still new, bulky, expensive, and fragile. Electronics were built with vacuum tubes, delicate components that did not like impact or vibration. and a shell fired from a naval gun experiences acceleration so violent that every tiny part inside it becomes, for a brief moment, a crushing weight. The fuse would have to survive forces measured in tens of thousands of gi, spinning at high speed, heating and cooling, rattling through the air, all while functioning perfectly. It would have to survive and then think, because a proximity fuse isn't just a sensor, it's a decision maker. It has to detect, interpret, and trigger within the tiny window that separates near enough from too far. Other nations explored the concept. The challenge wasn't imagination. It was engineering. Making something small enough was hard. Making it rugged enough was harder. Making it cheap enough and reliable enough for mass production, and so it could be fired not once, but millions of times, seemed beyond reach. Yet the United States, pushed by necessity and powered by an industrial base capable of turning prototypes into fleets, pursued it with an urgency that matched the stakes of the war. The Pacific, in particular, created an unforgiving demand. Naval warfare depended on task forces operating far from home, and those forces lived under the constant threat of air attack. The question became immediate and brutal. How do you stop an aircraft that is willing to die if it can take you with it? That pressure turned an impossible idea into a national priority, and it was developed under layers of secrecy, because everyone involved understood what would happen if the enemy got their hands on an intact example. One of the hardest problems the proximity fuse had to solve wasn't even the radar part. It was power. A device that transmits and receives a radio signal needs electricity, and early in the war, that usually meant a battery. But batteries created two terrifying problems for a wartime arsenal. First, shelf life. Ammunition has to be stockpiled for months, transported across oceans, stored in magazines, moved between ships and depots. A battery that slowly dies on the shelf turns a revolutionary weapon into a dud the moment you need it. Second, safety. If the battery is always active, you risk accidental arming, accidental detonation, and catastrophic chain reactions in tightly packed storage. So the fuse needed a power source that would remain inert during storage and transportation, then activate only after firing, when it could no longer threaten friendly stockpiles. The solution was the kind of clever, ruthless practicality that defines great wartime engineering. The battery inside the fuse stayed asleep until the moment it was launched. A sealed glass Ampulon electrolyte vial was kept separate from the battery plates. As long as the electrolyte was isolated, nothing happened. No chemical reaction with power solved. The fuse needed a way to sense proximity. The concept was a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, something radar-like, broadcasting a signal and listening for its reflection. As the shell approaches an aircraft, the reflected signal shifts because motion changes how that signal returns. Engineers exploited that shift to create what amounts to a measurable beat inside the circuitry, a signature that grows stronger and more meaningful as the distance closes. Amplify it, filter it, and when the signal crosses the threshold that corresponds to lethal range, the fuse triggers the detonator. That trigger had to be instant and reliable, and it used fast-switching tube technology, a tiny electrical gate that stays closed until the right signal forces it open. When it opens, the detonation chain fires, and the shell bursts at exactly the moment that creates the most effective fragmentation pattern around the aircraft. In plain language, the shell doesn't need to hit the plane. It needs to get close enough, and then it blows itself apart at the perfect moment to slice the air around the target into a lethal storm. And once you understand that, the real strategic meaning becomes clear. The proximity fuse didn't just improve aim. It changed the rules. It turned near misses into kills. Asterisk, the next step is where American power shows itself in a different way. Inventing something matters, but producing it matters more. A weapon that exists only in small numbers is a laboratory triumph, not a war-changing advantage. The proximity fuse became decisive because it moved from secret prototype to mass-produced reality at staggering scale. and it did so under security so tight it bordered on paranoia. Manufacturing was deliberately fragmented. Different factories built different sub-assemblies, and the full picture was intentionally concealed so that no single producer could easily understand the entire device. This wasn't only about efficiency, it was about protecting the secret. At peak, production reached numbers that sound like myth until you remember what wartime America could do. Hundreds of thousands of these fuses, rolling out on a routine basis. That scale is what turned a brilliant concept into a constant presence. It meant ships didn't have just a few experimental rounds. They had magazines filled with them. It meant a fleet could fight with them repeatedly. It meant the advantage didn't appear once, it persisted. The first combat use came early, at sea, because the ocean offered something land could not: secrecy through depth. A failed shell that splashed into the water sank, taking its secret with it. That mattered because the fear of capture haunted every decision. If the enemy recovered an intact fuse and reverse-engineered it, they could develop their own proximity fuses and erase the advantage. So early deployments were carefully controlled, focused on naval anti-aircraft defense, and initially concentrated where the risk of recovery was lowest. Then came that first moment where theory became real, when the fuse was fired not as a test, but under a real aerial threat from a ship that needed a better answer than hope. Reports from early 1943 describe the first combat firing in the Pacific and the first confirmed shoot-down with a VT-fused round. To the sailors involved, it wasn't just an engineering success. It was a new feeling in the gut, the feeling that the sky might be containable again. As the war progressed, the air threat intensified. In the Pacific, air attack wasn't an occasional danger. It was a constant. As American forces moved closer to Japan, the pressure sharpened, the attacks multiplied, and eventually desperation hardened into a new tactic of kamikaze attacks. Pilots committing to collision courses where survival wasn't part of the plan. That's the kind of threat that punishes any weakness in air defense. Against a kamikaze, good enough is not good enough because the aircraft doesn't need to survive to be lethal. It just needs to reach your ship. The proximity fuse attacked that grim logic. It increased the chances of destroying or disabling an aircraft before it reached impact range, even when the gunners couldn't land perfect direct hits. In massed attacks, that matters more than anything, because the difference between a few got through and almost none got through is the difference between a fleet that continues to fight and a fleet that burns. There are late war accounts describing picket destroyers off Okinawa, facing waves so heavy they sounded impossible, dozens and dozens of attackers. Aircraft coming in low and fast at the ship's gunners, armed with VT-fused ammunition, were able to produce shoot-downs at rates that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Whether any single dramatic statistic is debated in retellings, the operational reality is not. The VT fuse materially increased the lethality and efficiency of naval anti-aircraft fire, and that translated directly into survival. The clearest way to understand impact is not always a heroic anecdote. Sometimes it's a cold statistic. Anti-aircraft defense before proximity fuses often required staggering expenditures of ammunition to bring down a single aircraft, especially under conditions where time fuses were set imperfectly and targets maneuvered aggressively. In some historical discussions, the contrast is illustrated by the famous thousands of rounds per aircraft problem in earlier air defense contexts compared to dramatically lower numbers. Once VT fuses were introduced, sometimes falling to double digits or low hundreds depending on theater and conditions. The exact figures can shift based on how you count and what scenario you mean. That effectiveness created a new dilemma. When you possess a weapon that powerful, when do you risk using it over land where a dud might be recovered? For a long time, the answer was cautious restraint. The weapon was too valuable to risk losing. The fear wasn't hypothetical. A proximity fuse was, in effect, a concentrated package of advanced wartime electronics and methods. If it fell into enemy hands intact, it could accelerate enemy development and erase the American edge. That caution is part of why the VT Fuze story feels like a thriller. It wasn't merely built, and winter in the Ardennes is the kind of cold that makes metal sting your skin and makes breath hang in the air like smoke. In December 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, trying to fracture Allied momentum. American units found themselves under extreme stress, defending crossroads and towns, fighting in forests where the enemy could infiltrate and where artillery could decide everything. This is where proximity fuses did something terrifyingly effective. Artillery shells equipped with VT fuses could detonate in the air above troops, showering fragments downward into formations. Another theater presented a different kind of threat. Germany's V-1 flying bombs, pilotless weapons launched toward Britain. They were fast and difficult to stop, and defending against them required speed, coordination, and precision. Proximity fuses contributed to improved anti-aircraft effectiveness because they increased the probability that shells would detonate at lethal distances as they passed near the target, turning near misses into meaningful hits in the air. Again, the significance wasn't only in one campaign. It proved the VT fuse wasn't a one-trick invention. It was adaptable, scalable, and decisive across multiple threats: manned aircraft, suicide attackers, pilotless bombs, and ground targets. Wherever the problem was timing and distance in three-dimensional space, proximity fusing offered a solution. So how did the United States pull this off? Not just the invention, but the complete package: research, ruggedization, production, secrecy, distribution, and sustained success? The answer isn't a single genius or a single lab. It's a system. It's what happens when a country combines scientific imagination with industrial depth and then adds operational discipline to turn ideas into results. The proximity fuse required physics, radio engineering, vacuum tube miniaturization, mechanical ingenuity, chemistry for power systems, production engineering, quality control, and logistics. It required testing that was relentless and standards that were unforgiving because failures weren't acceptable in combat. It required a supply chain that could deliver enormous quantities of complex fuses into the hands of crews who needed them, then maintain a pipeline that kept them coming. And it required a security apparatus that understood the stakes of capture and treated information as a weapon itself. That combination, innovate, mass-produce, protect, deploys one of the defining strengths of American wartime power. And the VT fuse is one of its clearest examples. There is also a human truth here that resonates deeply with veterans. Technology doesn't fight alone. It supports people who do. The sailors on picket stations, the gunners, the fire control teams, the ammunition handlers, the officers making split-second decisions. None of them were replaced by the proximity fuse. Their courage didn't become less necessary, but their chances improved. Their work became more effective. Their weapons became more honest. The difference between surviving an attack and becoming another burning silhouette on the horizon often comes down to whether your systems work under the worst conditions imaginable. The VT fuse was one of those rare systems that, when it worked, felt like it was bending the odds back in favor of the men who had to hold the line. It didn't guarantee safety. Nothing did. But it raised the probability of survival. And in combat, probability is life. After the war, the world rushed into new technologies: jets, guided missiles, early computers, radar networks, modern air defense. But the core idea behind the proximity fuse never died. Sense the environment. Detect proximity. Decide fast. Detonate at the optimum moment. It was a seed idea born in vacuum tubes and glass ampules that grew into later generations of smart munitions and proximity sensors across every domain. The VT fuse wasn't smart in the modern sense, but it represented a leap in the relationship between ammunition and information. It was a moment when a projectile stopped being purely ballistic and became responsive. when a shell didn't merely travel to a predicted point, but actively reacted to the target's nearness. That's why the proximity fuse holds a special place in the history of warfare. It isn't glamorous like a fighter ace. It isn't as photogenic as a battleship broadside. Yet its influence is woven into the texture of late war combat, especially in the Pacific, where it helped protect carriers and task forces during the era when air attack was often the most dangerous threat a sailor could face. It helped increase anti-aircraft effectiveness at precisely the moment the threat grew more desperate and more lethal. It helped reduce the number of rounds required to achieve results, which meant ships could defend themselves longer, with less waste and a better chance of stopping attackers before impact. It contributed to defense against pilotless weapons. It transformed artillery lethality in the forests of Europe. It did all of this quietly, hidden inside casings, fired by crews who often never saw the engineering inside the fuse. Only the difference it made in the sky. And if you want to understand what it felt like from the enemy's perspective, imagine watching aircraft approach a fleet and expecting the familiar patterns of flak bursts that can be dodged if you're clever. Near misses that don't matter if you keep coming. A dangerous sky, but one with gaps you can slip through. Then imagine the sky changes. Bursts appear at the worst possible distances, too close, too frequent, too consistent. Aircraft begin to fail, not only after direct hits, but after almost hits. The old instincts fail. The old tactics fail. And suddenly, your advantaged speed, altitude, unpredictability no longer guarantees survival. That is what stunned means in this story. Not theatrical surprise, but tactical shock. The realization that the Americans didn't just bring more guns. They made those guns count in a way you didn't think was possible. In the end, the VT proximity fuse is a case study in how the United States fought World War II at its most effective. Identify a deadly operational problem. Mobilize science to solve it. Mobilize industry to produce it at scale. And mobilize forces to use it where it would matter most. It is the story of a tiny device with enormous consequences. A smart shell that turned near misses into lethal hits and made the air a much more dangerous place for anyone who believed timing errors and evasive maneuvers would keep them safe. It's the story of how fractions of a second, hidden inside a piece of technology the size of a human hand, could decide whether a ship lived or died. And if this deep dive changed the way you see World War II, if it gave you a new appreciation for the American engineers, sailors and gunners who made victory possible not just through courage but through capability, then support the channel. Leave a like so this video reaches more people who care about the real mechanics of history. And subscribe to Architects of Power for more long-form documentaries on the strategies, technologies, and decisions that shaped the modern world. Because behind every decisive moment on the battlefield, there's often a quiet innovation that turned the odds, and the VT proximity fuse was one of the most important of them all.